Hello, and welcome back to the Classical Training Ground. Last time discussed Genesis, we saw that after finishing creation, God made Adam in his own image to subdue the world to God's rule. He gave Adam both a priestly and a royal task in that dominion. If Adam should succeed in this task without sinning, he would win the right to eternal life for himself and his offspring. Today, we'll see if he actually did succeed in that task. In Genesis 3:1, we meet the serpent, whom the author describes as the cleverest of all the creatures of the field. Notice three things about his question to the woman. Did God actually say, "You shall not eat of any tree in the garden"? Again, we're going to focus on three features of this one question. First, the serpent asks, Did God actually say? Now, remember the point of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's supposed to signify Adam and his wife's rejection of autonomy and submission to God's rule. By saying, Did God actually say? The serpent is encouraging the woman to question God's authority and consider the attractions of autonomy. Hand in hand with questioning God's authority, notice that the serpent goes to the woman instead of Adam. Remember back in Genesis 2:15 that God had appointed Adam as his priest in the garden. This means that Adam is supposed to be God's vice regent. So, by going to the woman with this question, the serpent is bypassing God's vice regent and putting the woman in his place, thus subverting the authority structure that God had established. Subverting God's authority, the serpent misquotes God in order to make his authority seem displeasing and withholding. Remember back in Genesis 2:16-17, when God actually said, You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Here the serpent changes God's command to say, You shall not eat from any tree in the midst of the garden. God's actual command focused on the provision with one qualifier. Here the serpent twists the command in order to make it sound more restrictive and to make God sound like he was withholding something good and right. And it works. At first, in verse 2, the woman appears to be correcting the serpent when she says, We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. Now notice that the word all has been completely removed from the quote. That may not mean much, but keep reading in verse 3. Because the serpent has framed the command around restriction rather than God's provision, she herself misquotes God. You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. Now back in Genesis 2:16-17, God never actually said, Neither shall you touch it. Sure, touching may not be a wise choice, but adding it to God's command further makes him sound like a withholding tyrant. Now that the serpent has cast God's authority and goodness into question, Adam and his wife are ripe for seduction. Notice 2 points about what the serpent says next in verses 4 and 5. You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. First, the serpent outright denies God's threat. With God's authority cast into doubt, why should Adam and his wife take the threat seriously? More importantly, however, by encouraging the woman to grasp at autonomy through the tree that signifies submission to God, the serpent deceives her into thinking that she will be like God. But notice back in Genesis 1:26, where God had said that he would make man in his image and in his likeness. By being in God's image, Adam and his wife were already like God. What the serpent tells them is that reflecting God's authority isn't good enough. God is withholding the real goods from them. By seizing autonomy for themselves, they can be their own gods. Here, we see the origin of the relationship between autonomy and idolatry. Verse 6, we see the woman buy into this temptation hook, line, and sinker. But she isn't the only one. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate. In other words, Adam has been there the whole time. Remember one of his priestly duties, to guard the sanctuary from anything unclean. As soon as he'd heard, did God actually say, Adam should have driven the serpent out immediately. Instead, he sat there and let the serpent convince his wife to subvert his own and God's authority. By seducing the woman, the serpent successfully seduced Adam too. The serpent truly was clever. Now, in order to keep this video from getting too long, I'll save the consequences of Adam's choice for next video here on the Classical Training Ground. Please like and subscribe. If you'd like to become a student with the Classical Training Ground, click the link below in the description and enter the details.